Alright guys, welcome to the show. I hope you sat there, either fucking scantily clad or dressed in your World Around You branded clothing. If you're not, go to worldaroundyou.com, order yourself a t-shirt, listen to these shows, and then come back to these shows when you've got your t-shirt and listen to the show in your t-shirt. Anyway, I'll let you crack on with the show. Alright guys, I'm the World Around You, and this is Pause for Thought on Fresh Old FM, and it's time to grab your snorkels because this week we're looking into the flood myths throughout time. It's a story that we're all aware of, and it's a story that's still used to this day to control most of us, a tale that's been repurposed since 17th century BC in Mesopotamia, all the way through to the Mafia, and even to today, and quite possibly the day after tomorrow too. The less well-received sequel to the original dystopian future film, The Day After Tomorrow. Anyway, let's have a song and then we'll get started. This is Not So Super 8 from Brother Ali's new album, Brother Minitster Volume 1. And all the tracks on the album are about a minute long, so you can get through it in about 15 minutes. It's a nice little album. So, getting into the flood stories, the flood myths. The first telling of the flood is from some ancient Mesopotamian tablets, but there's a more detailed version about it from a little bit later during what's known as ancient Babylonian times, as compared to, the modern day Babylonian tales, which are much harder to follow and some might say are just made up entirely on the spot right now. Anyway, it's a bunch of words that you've probably heard before, the title of it, and it's called the Epic of Gilgamesh. Now, I haven't read the whole thing, I'll be dead honest, I've only read parts, and I really want to read it. It is one of the few books that I would like to read. And the part of it that we're going to focus on, though, is the bit about the flood, obviously given the name and the title of the show, Flood Myths. Now, the majority of the Epic of Gilgamesh seems to be very, very similar to the Mesopotamian stories as well, which seems to also be a lot of what the Bible's based on, at least like the first quarter of it or so, where it's much more fantastical, really. And I think the Mesopotamian stories are very similar because people seem to argue that it's around about the same times, and most of the time it's about the same beings or gods or aliens, whatever you'd want to call them. Now, one thing that's really weird, though, is that these stories seem to be built around two main gods called Ea, spelled E-A, and Enlil, which is weird, isn't it? Because, as many of you all know, the ancient Sumerian text that got translated by Zechariah Sitchin, there was two aliens in that called Enki and Enlil, who were the equivalent of the godheads, the kingpins, the big bosses of the god world at the time. They were like the managers of Earth. Like in a shop, you've got the manager of the shop, and then you've got the floor manager and the line manager. Well, these were the manager, like the guy that's got his own office, not the guy that just stands at the end of the aisle staring at you while you're not working. And that's exactly what they are in this story. They seem to be in charge of it, making big decisions and not making the big decisions of who lives and who dies. Except though in Babylonian times, Enki from the Zechariah Sitchin translations, he was known as Ea. I don't know what we'll call him. I don't know how to pronounce it. Ea is weird, isn't it? Like, so Enki was known as Ea. But that's going to sound weird. But we'll try and stick with it. Fuck it, I'll try and stick with it. Yeah, a couple hundred years, before Enki was then again. It was weird. I don't know how to put it into words because the story seems to go from Enki to Ea to Enki again, throughout time, which is weird. But for the time that we're focusing on there, Enki was known as Ea. But anyway, I'm fucking rambling. The story of the flood itself, right, stems around a plant, apparently, in this telling of the epic within the Epic of Gilgamesh, and it's a plant rooted in mystical powers that many believe could bring about eternal youth, right? And that's all it really says about it. It doesn't tell us much more in there about it. Now, the story itself, the overall story, the big long story, is called the Epic of Gilgamesh, but this portion of the epic is more so about a fella called Utanapishti. And we'll call him UN in it because that's much easier than keep pronouncing Utanapishti. Now, I think at the time, UN was the leader of the known world as well, which is weird, isn't it? Although Gilgamesh himself was aware that the flood was coming because he was told by Ea, which obviously is just Enki, and the flood was coming to destroy the human race as well. We need to know this because the flood was coming because humans had become annoying, innit, with all the noise that they were making, and they were making a bit of a commotion and that, and fucking Enlil didn't like it, basically. He wasn't keen on all the noise they were doing. So he's like, you know what, I'm going to fucking kill them all, fuck him, you know. But, yeah, they don't want them all to die, you know, so they were pretty keen on some of the people, you know. They liked some of the people. They didn't like them all, so they were all happy to get rid of some people. But, yeah, decided that Enlil should probably let a few of them live, right? And if I remember right, in the stories of from the Emerald Tablets of Thoth, Enki was the creator of humans as well, who made the humans by mixing their DNA with other creatures. So it does kind of make sense that the what should we call him? The Dr. Mephisto of Earthport 1, otherwise known as Iraq or ancient Mesopotamia, wouldn't want to lose his creations, especially, you know, since the loss of Terence at the hands of Barbra Streisand. Anyway, in the story that was told to Gilgamesh at the time, the UN heard the voice of Ea and was instructed to build a boat. Maybe instructed might be a bit strong. He was advised to build a boat in order to save himself and his family, along with all living things, right? Which is a job and a half, innit, really, you know. Now, the flood itself apparently lasted 6 days and 7 nights, kind of like a shit holiday, to be honest. But back then, they would have a leader in that area for what was known as 10 Sars, and each Sar was 3,600 years long, so I do think it's fair to assume that a week back then was probably a lot longer period of time than what it is now, and a day probably wasn't the equivalent of 24 hours, or if 24 hours may have took a much, much longer time. I've never understood how they translate Sars and that to years, because surely the Earth was in a different position in the sky to the Sun in relation to it, so a year could still be a year. It takes a year to revolve. A year is just a measurement of how long it takes for the sun to go around. A year is just how long it takes the flat Earth to move around the sun. In it at the end of the day, but we won't go into flat Earth. This is more so hollow Earth territory, realistically. But we'll get into that later. And anyway, there's loads of fucking conflating facts as well surrounding the animals that were saved. Some stories seem to claim that I think it was 7 clean animals and 2 unclean animals. And I'd guess with them stories as well that the unclean animals were a cow and a sheep of some description, bovine and fucking, what the other one? Bovine is sheep, innit? Bovine is cows. What's sheep? I can't remember the name for sheep that ends in iron, but either way, irrelevant. Now, they sacrificed a minute as a sort of way to appease the gods before they were able to find land, which probably unnecessary, to be honest, because he still started fucking around with birds and all. But all of that's irrelevant at the minute anyway. What seems more important at the minute is this boat, innit? Because a boat could easily mean a ship or just something that floats, right? And I put it to you, listener, that floating thing is the moon. Right? I've said it before in past episodes, but it makes sense if you think about it. The moon is fucking well away from the water, right? So it's safe from the water, and the remaining humans left on Earth now seem obsessed with reaching it and going to it and stories about it. I also think it would probably be big enough to house most animals from Earth, especially if we was to take into account, you know, how many animals you can fit into a small space if you really wanted to. Because just before I try and explain, you know, exactly, I mean, think about, right, if you really wanted to, think about how many kittens you could force into a shoebox, just as one example. But if we take into, like, current regulations, at least in the UK, you can keep 9 chickens in a free-range farm for every square metre, right? So you can get quite a lot of chickens in a free-range farm. But they can manage up to 30,000 in each barn somehow, because obviously these barns must be massive. Now, just imagine if that was some form of battery farm, right? Now, if that was a battery farm, that's about 8 birds per 30 centimetre by 25 centimetre block or cage, right? And you could stack them as high as the ceiling. And you can have that ceiling, mate, as fucking high as you want, mate. You could make it as high as the Tower of Babylon so it just touches the heavens itself. And then you could fit fucking loads in. But let's pretend we're not doing that. Let's pretend it's a regular sized barn, right? Now, that means you can get at least 64 birds per every every metre cubed. Now, I know chickens are small, innit, but think about it, for this ark, for this boat, they only needed 2 of each breed. Plus, a lot of animals as well are also a lot smaller than your average chicken. So stashing all of these creatures inside the moon doesn't seem very unlikely at all if you think of it that way. They could even be fucking subdued, mate. Now, I'm not trying to brag, innit, but I reckon I could fucking knock out a chicken. So I reckon some guy from thousands of years ago who's going to be much smaller if fucking so-called scientists are to believe, and that we've gotten bigger over time. That means probably chickens have gotten bigger, but the equivalent of something the size of a chicken proportionally to us. I reckon when we were all little people, back, 7,000 years ago, or fucking however many SARS ago that is, 2.5. I reckon even back then, mate, even as a little person thousands of years ago, I reckon I could fucking knock out a budgie easily, mate, and stash him in a box and throw him in the moon. Well, maybe not throwing him in the moon would be the easy bit, but knocking out a load of fucking ducks and stuff and shoving them in a crate. Piece of piss, mate. I could do that now. I reckon I could probably knock out a duck with me blindfolded. If you put the duck in my hands, mate, dead easy. And you could do it as well, listening. And even if you're thinking to yourself, oh, but I don't have all my fingers, oh, I don't have both hands, fucking get creative, mate. You could hold it in one hand and fucking headbutt it with with your head, obviously. Anyway, distracted, right? But if they are all knocked out and unconscious, right, that's going to take up a lot less space in the boat, in these boxes. And there's even a good chance, right, that back then there was a lot less animals in existence, because if we are to believe quote-unquote scientists, when the moon was manufactured and built for this purpose, evolution had much less time to happen, so we wouldn't even have as many animals as what we have now. Anyway, animal-wise, right, we do know that Utanapishti had a fair few birds in his menagerie. I was going to say repertoire, but menagerie is better, isn't it? And maybe, there's a good possibility as well he even had birds to spare, because he was using them to test if it was safe to look outside. And this also proves, right, that it was difficult to see out of the boat that he was using and that he built, meaning, right, that there was no windows. Now, I don't know if that proves they didn't have the technology for glass or plastic or windows back then, or if it just means they didn't have windows built onto it, because you wouldn't see it as a necessity. There's a flood coming, a window's just, something that could leak. And, you don't want something that could leak on a boat, do you? Especially when you don't know how long you're going to be on it and this flood's like nothing you've ever seen. A porthole might be useful, because you can see underwater, but I don't know if it would withstand the pressure. But they may not have known about this 4 or 5 SARS ago, like 12,000, 14,000 years ago. And I've actually, it just adds credence as well, more idea to the belief that it probably was the moon, because I've never found any records anywhere, right, of there being windows built into the moon as we know now. It also gives a lot of weight to my theory about the week itself, that they were talking about the flood being in an old time measurement, just like cubits was an old measurement of distance, because the birds that he used were a raven, a dove and a swallow, right? Now, your average raven, when I looked it up, takes 22 days to hatch from its egg, and a dove takes about 15 days, and a swallow is around the same time or so as a dove. Now, it's a bit, you got to guess it a little bit here, but if we take all of that into account, then it's going to take about a month as well for them to, in total, let's say, maybe a little bit over a month, for the birds to be able to fly and be of use to Napishti UN, so I'd guess it at about a month and a bit, but They must have been breeding these birds on the boat as well for UN to be so comfortable to spare them. Because if he wasn't breeding these birds and like Noah he'd only brought 2 of each animal onto the boat, why did he spare the raven, the swallow and the fucking dove? Do you know what I mean? He could have, like pigeons, he could have thrown anything off, but he didn't. He used these, so he must have been breeding them on there. He must have had a collection. And his whole theory anyway was around this was that if he chucked them out, the birds wouldn't return, which in his eyes would mean that they were able to nest somewhere. Now, I've thought about it, and it just wouldn't be practical to throw baby birds out of the boat, because that would mean he wouldn't have had, to use all 3 species of them in it, because the dove and the swallow return to him, right? It also suggests, though, to me, that on this boat that UN had made, animal abuse must have been fucking rampant, mate, on this so-called ark, because I find it very hard to believe, that the birds would stay away from their home, because as we know, we all probably know, the hippocampus of many birds, especially swallows and pigeon breeds, have a swollen hippocampus, right? Now, that means that they've got more of a natural navigational ability than like humans, unless you're like a taxi driver or something. So, they know where they're going, and they know the way home as well. So you would really have to fucking torture these birds in order to prevent them from coming back to you. Otherwise, they're just going to keep returning like a fucking racing pigeon. Like, do you think if you take a racing pigeon to France and let it fly back over the channel, it comes home, mate? So it knows its way over water. So if you chuck it out of the ark, it's still going to come back. You know what I mean? It just doesn't... He would have had to be torturing them. He must have been abusing them in some way or other. Now, this is where the Christian telling of Noah tries to trick us all, because they tell their children that the dove returned with an olive branch. But realistically, this just seems like a way that the dove was trying to make peace with Noah and his clearly abusive family. And it's difficult to imagine just how you would abuse a dove or a swallow. But personally, I would suggest torturing their loved ones in front of them. And another good way to make a raven feel unwelcome would be to make it seriously depressed, because they're quite smart birds, innit? Let the mother raven brood, allow it to sit on its eggs and incubate its eggs for the first 18 days, and then smash them eggs up in front of it to drive it wild, mate. Now, I believe this could be one of the many methods used by UN to ensure a faithful worker in all of his bird species. Now, no evidence for it. It's just through reading and through research. That's what I think was probably going on. Personally, right? If I was to build a large boat and store all these animals and needed to measure this to see if the land was outside, I'd have used a load of the fish species, if I'm honest with you. I'd have tied a string to, each of the tails of the fish, and then had them all at different lengths around the boat. All the strings, because it must have been a massive boat, right? Imagine the size of the moon, mate. That's massive. Imagine all the fish you could tie on strings at different inch gaps and drop them into the water and just let them fucking... Because they'll swim for a bit and eventually they'll start drying out, won't they? Right? You'll start notice your fish are dying when you're pulling up the strings, right? And you start them at a foot long. You pull out the one at a foot long, still alive, drop it in. Give it another couple days. Pull it out. It's dead. It's suffocated in the air, right? Then you'd be able to work your way through all these fish to the desired length on the thread, where the water's resided enough for you to be able to return to normal life, right? I mean, you could also do it with frogs if you wanted to. That's a possibility. But if you really wanted to gain more space on your boat, then I imagine you would just use the larger mammals and do it in a reverse method. So using various lengths of line, you throw over the giant sloths, the woolly mammoths, the dinosaurs, and other creatures overboard that take up a lot of space until when you pull them back onto the ship, instead of them just being wet and angry or shivering, or maybe even just drowned and dead, you pull up just the leg. Because obviously the creature's spread itself across the ground beneath the boat once you've finally dried out the water beneath. But it's always easier to tell someone how to do their jobs, especially, from the comfort of your own living room. Anyway, let's have a song. This is Rise of the Machines by Jedi Mind Tricks. So, UN's Raven, right, never returned, and he took this as a sign that his abuse had been worthwhile and disembarked from the ship, and immediately he made an offering to the gods. Now, this offering got the interest of the mother goddess, who was, not distraught, let's not say distraught, but disheartened by the deaths of millions of what I think were her humans, and probably concerned that the rest of the humans were all going to stem from one family and all, because obviously being a goddess, she was fully aware of the problems caused by inbreeding, which is something that we learnt about in last week's episode with the ancient Greeks, and the episode before that in the ancient Egyptians and creationism. Now, this goddess, the mother goddess, she wore a necklace made from dead flies and claimed to be Utanapishti's she claimed to Utanapishti that necklace was always going to remind her of the dead humans, which is poetic, you think, but it's because of the way that the people floated on the water when they died resembled the necklace of dead flies that she wore on her chest. And if you would like to wear dead animals, dear listener, on your chest, I've currently got some dead crabs in necklaces available from my website, World Around You. worldaroundyou.com. That's worldaroundyou.com. Not all the gods, though, were sad because, the death of the humans and that, they didn't really seem to care the rest. The one that originally tried to eradicate all the humans, Enlil, he was pissed off because some of them had survived. Now, it was at this point that, or Enki, as he was later known and then otherwise known, he confided in Enlil that there are other ways, that you can control the populations of the humans and we can keep the numbers down, And it's easy to imagine how you do it because you do it through taxation, disease, famine, and maybe as well by keeping just enough water around from the flood to stop people from working together and growing in unity all at once together. Now, Enlil accepted the ideas that were put forward by Le, which, going off the state of the world, was equivalent to the gods holding their meeting on a Friday afternoon in the pub after work, and Enlil, in what could have been a moment of inebriation or possible spite, then allowed UN and his wife to have the gift of immortality, meaning that somewhere out there's at least 2 ancient people over at least 5 SARS old that are still alive to this day, though I imagine if there are any ruling authority in the world that knows where they are, they've most likely captured them and poured concrete on them and around them, keeping them alive but imprisoned in a dark and originally increasingly hotter and hotter prison, but now much, much cooler prison, never allowing them to break the surface ever again until, I imagine, they need to speak to the gods once more. But could it be that's what the UN actually is? Now, in olden times, UN stood for Uta-Nepishti, yet now it stands for United Nations, which kind of sounds similar in a way. Maybe the leaders of the countries all chat to each other at these meetings and then converse with UN to see if their ideas can be put forward to Enki and Enlil, though I can't really imagine Enlil would really care to be mithered by them, and it would probably be Enki that would try to help us out. Anyway, let's have a song. This is Fellas Navidad by the Heatmakers, Joel Ortiz, Fred the Godson and Jim Jones. Now, I know that there's a lot of people that already know about the story of Noah, so we'll cover it a bit quicker than what I did the Epic of Gilgamesh. It was during what seems to be God's adolescent phase. He hated everything and everyone around him, and arguably he did hate everyone actually until he had his son, and which he then aimed all of his hatred towards, until he eventually orchestrated his death whilst convincing his son it was all for the betterment of himself and the world. Just a world-class manipulator, realistically, but he was well versed in manipulating people, right? We got to remember that about God. He was very, very good at it. He made one bloke kill his own son and tortured many more, but one of his best known tantrums that God ever had, now this is God with a big G, not a little g, best known tantrums, guys, the Great Flood. Now the story goes that he was angry with the state of the world and how humans were, and then out of anger, he just decided to wipe them all out from existence. No intentions of ever replacing them, just fucking kill them all. But he decided that one man and his family were worthy of surviving. And that was Noah's missus and the kids that they had together. So he instructed Noah to build himself a massive boat, which is now known as an ark, right? And then he gave him the administrative duty of cataloguing all the known creatures of Earth and collecting a pair of each, presumably as well a breeding pair of each, which has got to be fucking hard and dangerous. Like, for some animals, piece of piss, but if you're thinking to yourself, well, I want a breeding pair of, I don't know, lions, for example, just as an obvious answer, lions would be hard. The female, just as lethal as the male. He's not getting an easy job by going for the female and then the male or vice versa. It was hard and increasingly hard, and how do you wrangle an elephant? Really, you can't pull on its trunk, it'll fucking kill you. Well, what do you do? Throwing mice at it? Just fucking throw mice at a fucking African elephants or Asian elephants, probably Asian elephants, it's the Middle East, though. I imagine Asian elephants would be nearer to there than African elephants would be. Still though, throwing fucking mice at it to scare it onto a boat, and then you've got fucking way too many mice knocking around, so that's no good for anyone. Unless, of course, you sell bad taxidermy, like worldaroundyou.com. But realistically, how likely is that going to be that Noah was doing that? I think Noah was just a carpenter, which explains why he was able to build the boat. But these I'd argue, right, that God really didn't respect Noah, because it's put across that he liked him enough to ensure his survival. But realistically, God still killed everyone that Noah knew, minus his kids and wife, and then gave him the laborious task of counting to 2 well over 1,000,000 times. Well over. So he's basically just gone 1, 2, yep, 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 1, 1, 1. Where's the other Siberian tiger? Oh, there it is. 2, 1, 2, yep, 1, 2, yep, 1, 2, yep, 1, 2, 3. Oi, Jimmy, freaking little Jimmy, come and pick one of them for him. Now, pick one, the middle one. All right, and then he obviously turns to his daughter, Mary, come here. Kill or keep? Kill. Oh, you're a cruel one, Mary. You're a cruel one. Right, little Jimmy, kill that one. I know you liked it, I know, and it does have a lovely pattern to it, it does, but we just don't need 3 of them. Alright, yeah, you can use me hammer, yeah, not a problem, use the hammer. That'll do, that one got it. Yep, 1, 2, 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 yep. Fucking boring, mate. Fucking boring thing to make someone do. It's cruel. It just seems like he wanted to drive Noah crazy, innit? And I'd say he did everyone else the favour by killing them all, but he then punished Noah the most intensely out of everyone. You know, he then, much like Enlil did to Unapishti, UN, gave him the so-called gift of immortality as well, which I would argue is the greatest punishment you could probably give a person. Never-ending life, mate. Watching the whole of human existence and whatever comes after it, you know, whatever that may be, robots, machines, single-celled organisms rising up and becoming people. You don't know. And your cells constantly mutating, burning inside you all the way through time. Your body adapting to circumstances slower than what is needed. Feeling like you're constantly suffocating in the new air millions of years in the future, just wishing for death. No one ever believing you either, that you're the Noah from the stories or you're the fucking UN, the original UN, you know, no one would believe. An outcast, out of time, true torture, mate. Fucking God ain't a nice guy, mate. Now, I think Noah's flood lasted 40 days and nights, I think, which is a time frame that gets thrown around a lot in the Bible, because Jesus also had a 40-day fast in the desert where he met the devil and chilled with him for a bit. And then Noah, right, after the flood started to end, Noah then started throwing birds out of the ark in the hopes that they would deliver a message. Initially, he started off with the penguins. He threw the penguins overboard, but they never returned. And he started with the rock hoppers and finished with the emperors, but none of them returned. As it turned out, they could swim. And they didn't know this because they were living in Mesopotamia time, you know, that sort of area, Iraq, and that. They weren't used to penguins. They didn't know what they were capable of. They just seen them hobble on, had wings, beaks. They can fly. No, they can't. They just swam away. And that's how, you know, the penguins ended up in such fucking huge, vast distances away from each other all around the southern hemisphere, you know, because they were just dropping them out of the ark during these, what we could probably call experiments, you know, and it also adds to the idea as well that the world actually did flood out from the hollow earth, because penguins are, like I say, mostly in the southern hemisphere, and the access to the hollow earth is in Antarctica, which is in the very bottom of the southern hemisphere. And if they'd flooded the hollow earth under the rule of one leader, let's call him God or the King is what he's supposed to be known, then they would eventually just float out of that hole in this boat or moon, and that allows, you know, the hole being the hole at Antarctica, just to be clear, and, you know, the hole that allows other people like the Nazis to go into the hollow earth. But I mean, that's just a theory. Anyway, the penguins went first, he chucked them over, then the seagulls, then the pelicans, but they just floated around the boat waiting for the waters to disappear. They'd grown quite attached because Noah wasn't into abusing the animals like Unapishti was. One seagull picked up a piece of floating detritus and brought it onto the ark to try and build a nest. But Noah thought this was a gift, and that's where he got the idea to send out a land-dwelling bird. He also allowed the seabirds back into their boxes with the loved ones on the ark, because this is where he got that idea, great idea, and he wasn't an animal abuser. And this is also from the seagull bringing this back in and being able to go back to his wife, his seagull-y wife. This is where we get the phrase, one good turn deserves another. Now, scholars are actually contested as to whether he sent a dove or a raven, but we know it definitely wasn't a macaw, as there's no record of him ever using this Amazonian species to his advantage. In the most mainstream stories, he chucked a dove off the boat, and after wafting around at it with like an old broom handle, it eventually flew off and later returned with a piece of an olive branch. Now, whilst waiting though, Noah had started to get upset in it because well, I lied. I was trying to pick him up, but he had actually started abusing the animals on board the ark. And initially, it was just for fun to pass the time. He later recounted in his biography that the animals would strike curious poses. When speaking about the torture using the hot coals, he explained they'd feel the heat. And that he regretted having the butterflies all tied up. He never expected the dove to return, because whilst wafting it with the broom handle, the dove squawked an unusual squawk, and as it took off, he claims he shouted, "Don't make me chase you," and turned to his son and told him, "Even doves have pride." Later that night, the dove returned with the olive branch and cooed gently outside Noah's bedroom door as he slept. He awoke and told his wife, "Listen. Fucking listen! That there. This is what it sounds like when doves cry." The next day, Noah and his family started dropping off the animals where they could, and then they decided that it might be a good idea to dump all the more dangerous ones out the way of the Middle East where they resided and lived the normal days, and dumped most of the dangerous ones off in Australasia and Africa. Let's have a song. This is The Realist by Benny the Butcher, Green Lantern and Heem. Just a minute, guys. I just wanted a little calm advert for you, a little calmer advert. And if you're like me, a pseudo-intellectual, what you might enjoy are my books. You've got Uneducated Guesses, where I found a load of big words I don't know the meaning to, and then tried to work out what they mean by breaking down the syllables and drew an illustration for each one. You've got How to Date an Antique Table, A Lover's Guide, which is a book that will tell you how to get your end away with an antique table, complete with how to find an antique table, where to take an antique table on a date, like you could take it dogging, you could take it to the cinema, you could take it for a picnic, and some chat-up lines as well, like, "I know I'm drunk, but you look absolutely canted." And even then you got some pictures in the back of some of my taxidermy and that as well. And you've got my third book, More You Know, which is a book of very well-researched fake facts. Just a book of lies, basically. And some of them were suggested, as in topic-wise, were suggested by some of the people from TikTok. So you might, even if you took part in that, you might even have your username on the first couple pages of that book. Anyway, if you, like I say, if you're enjoying these, you might like the books. And you can get access to the books through Patreon or through my website. Or fucking let you crack on with the show, guys. The flood myth itself still gets perpetuated to this day as well. Every kid, right, is taught about the dangers of the ancient floods. There are stories all over the world, but we'll focus on the English-speaking world for now. But just to mention, there was a few from China, quite a few from the Middle East. There was a couple African ones. There was North American ones, South American ones, European ones, and more in the Far East as well. But we will stick to the English-speaking ones because I know what they were saying. So a lot of English-speaking people are in some way or other all Christian as well, and they all know about Noah and the stories about him, and the flood and how it decimated the world. But I think that's just made up in order to be able to control children as they become older. Because think about Greta Thunberg, for example, or Al Gore and the other environmentalists. They're all obsessed with the idea that the end times are coming. And ever since a little kid, I've had it drilled into my head by teachers and by the telly that we're all personally responsible for destroying an environment we've only just been born into. And that destruction is going to cause the fish to rise up against us and wash away our beaches and cities until we're all underwater. Or much like, if you remember the Mother Goddess's dead fly necklace floating on the surface of the expanded oceans. The idea of water killing us all or being the end of people as we know it, that's a trope that gets used a lot, innit? For example, think about the mafia expression, sleeping with the fishes. It means that they're going to drown you. But there's loads of ways to kill people and dispose of the bodies, because think about meat processing factories, right? Realistically, you don't know how many military intelligence officers or gangsters you've eaten in your mass-produced sausages. So why is the focus always on dying by water? If we bring a film into it, other than the top of the show I mentioned The Day After Tomorrow, but think about Scarface, right? The first proper vicious murder in that was in a bathtub, mate. In Psycho, mate, one of the main scenes in Psycho, in a bathtub. Water, a place where people are usually submerged in water, drip feeding it into our heads. That submersion in water is going to ruin us all, going to kill us all, that we should be scared of being underwater. Again and again and again, it's death and water. It's a thing that is being repeated to us in everything and everything you watch. A lot like how genetic splicing is in every TV show in one way or another. The moon is in every TV show in one way or another. The fact that there's some emphasis on there being a genetic splicing facility inside the moon is in everything that you watch, especially kids' films and that. Now that's why I think it's all repeated so much, because it's all the same story. It's all from this great flood. It's the main story. Well, the question is, I suppose, is the main story some faucet of the great flood, or have I just managed to tap into something that I shouldn't have done? However you look at it, though, the flood was there. The flood is here, and it will come again. Another Christian belief as well is that we can wash away our sins, and that's what the global warming myth's all about. We've all committed crimes against the globe by using antiperspirant and driving cars, but the water's going to come and wash us, the sinners, away. Let's have a song. This is Jim Jones with 3 Cuts. And that's all I've got for you this week. I'll look more into these other flood myths and I'll get back to you with them eventually, and I'll try and get my hands on some books as well about the Anunnaki, and we'll cover that soon. I'll be back tomorrow night with Jimmy Budd at 7 PM for Truth Seeking. You just have a listen to Truth Seeking, give that a search, and later today Jimmy will be on as well on Threshold FM with Jim will mix it. I'll fucking see you in a bit, guys.
Thanks for listening, man. If you enjoyed the show, you should probably go and try Truth Seeking. That's TROOF Seeking, as in like SEEKING, not like a fucking type of helicopter. But it's me and Jimmy Budd, a comedian from the UK, from England, like me. Don't know why I'm saying it like that. Either way though, go and fucking have a listen. You can find 1 or 2 in the feed for this. There's the Crop Duster, but there should be, by the point you're listening to this, at least 15 episodes going out for Truth Seeking. So you might enjoy that, mate, and fucking leave a review on here and that. Leave a comment if you've watched it on YouTube. And if you do have YouTube as well, you can actually watch some of these. You can have them playing on a loop, with my cartoon playing on a loop whilst you listen to 4 or 5 episodes of it. So, maybe throw that on at night time or something, because that might help as well, because that might mean I can eventually monetize my YouTube. Anyway, fucking thanks for listening, man. I'll see you in a bit.